I would also like to thank Joost for being our guest expert today. He's our EMI buster, and he helps companies solve and fixes EMC issues. And Joost also works with us on our customer projects to work and help companies solve, EMC challenges and pass them in first attempt. So thank you, Joost. Stage is all yours, and we can start the session now.
Awesome. I will share my screen. Okay, so the agenda for this hour. We'll dive more into the topic of radiated emissions. I think that's one of the most common reasons why EMC, one of the most common EMC tests that fail. Then we'll dive into some do-it-yourself measurements that you can do outside of an expensive lab, and we'll finalize that with a demonstration. On the picture here, you'll see you see a typical lab. It's a Faraday cage meant to keep radiation from other sources outside, and you see some nice white cones that prevent any reflections in such a way that you only measure the emission that originates from your device only once, and don't measure the reflections, because that would has the potential to double the level. This is a very high level overview of how such a test looks like. On the left, you'll see your device under test. It could be a small product, it could be a larger product. And then on a certain distance, we'll place an antenna. And that antenna picks up all the radio signals coming off from your product. And then there's a EMI receiver. That's a measurement equipment, looks like a spectrum analyzer. It's a little bit different on filtering, but you could think of it as a spectrum analyzer because it sweeps all different frequencies and measures the amount of emission coming out of your product, and registers that. And then you'll see in this picture the green line indicating the limit, and our goal is of course to stay well below the limits. This is an example of how a measurement result would look like. The horizontal red bars are the limit lines, and the two graphs, the blue one and the orange one, are the measurement results. And our goal here is to have the quasi-peak measurements, and those are the dots on the vertical pink lines, to have those under the limit lines. And this is really important information because it tells us something about how well our product is performing. If you perform a test, the outcome is always a pass or a fail, but that information alone doesn't tell you anything about the margin you have. So you can fail with 1 dB, you can fail or pass with 1 dB margin. The outcome pass or fail alone doesn't tell you anything about it. So it's always very interesting and meaningful to really read those results. One example about that is when you select the power supply. So, for example, this minimal supply. If you look into the data sheet, you already see that it is compliant to some EMC standards. So, in this case, Class B emission immunity criteria A. It tells you something about what you can expect from this product, but it doesn't tell you anything about the margin. And you also don't know how this was tested. So let's say you have a product and you place 2 of those compliant modules in there. We don't know anything about the outcome. So it's always good to assess this before you select a power supply. And now the big question is, of course, how are we going to measure that? So how to assess the radiated emission when you have, let's say, 2 options of a power supply, option B or option A and option B, which one gives you the best results? And you can, of course, go to a fancy, expensive EMC test room. you can reserve those and then spend quite a significant amount of money to get really accurate results. But I think it's always wise to ask yourself the question, do you really need that fancy equipment to say something about the emission of a product, of power supply, or maybe even your own product? And the answer to that question, I think, is yes, you really need that fancy equipment for the formal test. Those tests are very well defined, and you need calibrated equipment to perform the test as they should be performed. However, you don't need all that accurate equipment to learn a lot by assessing a situation on your lab bench. When we talk about radiated emission, you always think about, okay, so somehow radiation comes out of our product. So how is that happening? So apparently something acts as an antenna. And to illustrate you a little bit more how that works, I have here a picture of a dipole antenna. This is an ideal dipole antenna. We have a voltage source in the middle, and at each terminal we have a conductor. Conductor going up, conductor going down, and it just stops here. And when there's no voltage here in the middle of the source, the free electrons in these conductors are they don't face any voltage potential, and the distribution is just evenly spread around. However, as soon as we apply a voltage, a positive voltage, and then the electrons are repelled at the negative side, attracted at the positive side of the source, and this enables us to steer the distribution of charge. And distribution of charge and charge density represents a voltage. So by adding a voltage here, we can shift electrons, making a current flow. And note that this piece of wire is not closed in a loop with a conductor, but we are still able to cause some electron movement in these conductors. If we switch the voltage polarity, the opposite thing happens. So the electrons are again repelled at the negative side and attracted at the positive side, and then we move the electrons in the opposite way. If you then look at how the current and voltage look like if you put an alternating source on this antenna. So here it was a DC source to explain what happens with the electrons, but now we're going to put a high frequency on here. You will start to notice that electrons are again repelled or attracted. They pile up at the end, so that means that the charge density increases, and the voltage is the highest at the tip of the electrons. And of course, the electrons cannot flow any further, so at the absolute tip, the current should be 0, and is 0 in if you look into the current distribution of a dipole antenna conductor at one side, and the same happens, of course, at the other side. So this voltage and this current that is flowing up and down in this conductor creates a field. You get an E field. It spreads out around the environment, and because of Maxwell equations, electric field is changing. Changing electric field causes a changing magnetic field, and a changing magnetic field causes a changing electric field, and it goes on and on and on. And that causes a wave, electromagnetic wave that propagates outwards, causing the radiated, actually this is the radiated emission of this dipole antenna structure. So how great would it be if there was a way to assess the amount of radiated emission that comes out of this structure by some kind of measurements on your product itself? And this already gave us a clue. So there's a high current, current distribution density here and near the source. And it turns out that if you take this dipole antenna and you measure the current leaving the source, and you also measure the received field strength at the EMI, or sorry, EMC, it's an EMC receiver, but in the receiver in the EMC test lab, it turns out that there is a correlation